Dr. Jones, we are very eager to hear you. Lots of people waiting for this. Good afternoon. Whoa, it's still morning. Is it? It's afternoon. Okay.
Depends on where you are. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Some of you were at my last talk in Washington. I thought it was going to be the final talk I ever gave in Washington. Taki was there. He said the police were coming. We had to get out of the building. I'm talking about the Sam Francis Memorial talk I gave of happy memory, at least some happy memories. I've been thinking about Catholic social teaching intensely for about a year now, and you'll get the fruits of that intense thought this afternoon. But what I'd like to talk about today is something on a much more concrete basis. When I was a young man about the age of John Sharp, I was invited out to dinner by a very kind man who was a pillar of the traditionalist movement. And he said to me, nothing's going to go right until they restore the Latin Mass. And he believed that sincerely, and he eventually became the publisher of a magazine that is called Latin Mass Magazine. So he's true to his beliefs, okay? But I just found it unpersuasive at the time. For some reason, or maybe my own perverse personality, whatever it was, because I thought there's something more. I grew up during this period of time. Something else happened. I had this inchoate feeling at this point in my life that I had been a guinea pig in an experiment that no one was going to admit had taken place. And we know now that there were lots of experiments that did take place, and they don't want to talk about them anymore. LSD was one of them. People jumping out of windows because they put LSD in their coffee and didn't tell them. The CIA was involved in that. The government was involved in that. In terms of the psychological warfare community, these operations have a name. They're called black operations. And black operations have one thing in common. They always get out of control. And so what I'd like to talk about today is a black operation. And it came about with a specific purpose in mind. When one of these encyclicals, I forget whether it's Quadragesimo Anno or Rerum Novarum, talks about the restoration of the social order. Well, just at the time when Quadragesimo Anno was being promulgated throughout the world, there was a concerted effort to destroy the social order in the United States of America. And the name of that black operation was called social engineering. Now, you'll never hear people talk about it anymore because it's a colossal embarrassment to all the people who were the most likely to be involved or their descendants. But it was a very real operation, and it had a very real purpose in mind. And the real purpose in mind was the destruction of our communities. And I'm talking about our communities in terms of our neighborhoods, our meaning Catholic, and our parishes in cities where we held a lot of political power. And one of those cities was Chicago. As many of you know, I've written a book on this topic. It's called Slaughter of Cities, and that lovely lady over there will sell you a copy if you want. But in that book, I covered this systematic destruction in 4 cities: Philadelphia, where I grew up, Detroit, Boston, and Chicago. And of all the cities, Chicago fared best, Detroit fared worst, and Philadelphia is right down at the bottom, probably. But what I'm talking about here is came clear to me when I was asked to give a speech at a traditionalist chapel about 5 years ago outside of Chicago. I mean, way outside of Chicago. I mean, we're talking western suburbs that are just east of San Francisco. They're so far away from Chicago. And the question that crossed my mind at this point was, the question is, why are we here? Well, why are we here? Well, we're here because we're not there. And where is there? There is Chicago. And where is Chicago in particular? It was places like Visitation Parish, where my parents grew up, where, in a sense, I grew up to a certain extent. I'm old enough to have known that life. And there are pictures of Visitation Parish where graduation ceremonies in the mid-40s, where you can look the street, I forget what street it is, but anyway, on the one side of the street there are girls in caps and gowns as far as the eye can see. And this was the Visitation High School girls' graduation. And on the other side of the street, there is a band, and that stretches down as far as the eye can see, and that's the parish band. Now, that was a world that was a world, a Catholic world, that had a real existence, and it was, in a sense, the social order. A real social order, not some theoretical social order. It was a real social order. It was a real Catholic social order that was tolerated in a country that was by no stretch of the imagination Catholic, as Gary and John have pointed out. But it was tolerated, and it was tolerated to a certain extent, to such an extent that it allowed a certain group of people to flourish. And at a certain time, this was part of what it meant to be America. This was the America of, let's say, from the 1880s, or if you're Irish, maybe the 1840s, up till to World War II. And then at that point, a situation where this was just America. That was you were just as American as everyone else. Suddenly, the rules got changed like that by people who were not elected to office. And they got changed without telling anybody, and what was acceptable behavior suddenly became unacceptable behavior, and it eventually became criminal behavior, which is where it stands today. So what I'd like to talk about right now is a very concrete instance of how, in America, the social order was destroyed. As I said, the issue here is social engineering. Social engineering became part of the American vocabulary in 1942 with the publication of a book called The American Dilemma. Now, the author of this book is a Swede who else but should know America better than a Swedish socialist, by the name of Gunnar Myrdal. The book is 1,400 pages, which is actually 200 pages longer than the Jewish Revolutionary Spirit. So the difference between my book and Myrdal's book is that I wrote my book. Gunnar Myrdal did not write that book. I found this. I've received confirmation of this from various sources, but Alan Carlson, who used to work for the Rockford people, as a Swede, an American Swede, idolized Myrdal and called him up and wanted to talk to him, and he realized that Gunnar Myrdal did not want to talk about the American dilemma. Well, I know why he didn't want to talk about it, because it's an embarrassment to him. He could not have written it, which I'll explain later. But this is what he said. Now remember, who is this guy? He's a Swede. He's coming here at the behest of the Carnegie Foundation, which is run by Alger Hiss at that time. You all heard of Alger Hiss. And he's brought in, and now he's going to tell us about the future of America. And this is what he said. From the point of view of social sciences, this means, among other things, that social engineering will increasingly be demanded. It doesn't say by whom. Many things that for a long period have been predominantly a matter of individual adjustment will become more and more determined by political decision and public regulation. We are entering an era, now the era is after World War II because it's winding down, where fact-finding and scientific theories of causal relations will be seen as instrumental in planning controlled social change. The peace will bring nothing but problems, one mounting upon the other, and consequently new urgent tasks for social engineering. The American social scientist, because of the New Deal and the war, is already acquiring familiarity with planning and practical action. He will never again be given the opportunity to build up disinterested social science. Social engineering of the coming epoch, Myrdal continues, will be nothing but the drawing of practical consequences from the teaching of social science that human nature is changeable, that human deficiencies and unhappiness are, in large degree, preventable. We have today in social science a greater trust in the improvability of man and society than we have ever had since the Enlightenment. So guess what? He's saying the exact opposite of what Richard Weaver said. In other words, there is no human nature, and basically everything is a function of environment. And so guess what? If you change the environment, you change the human being. So guess what the next step is? The engineers are going to change the environment. And what are the two most significant aspects of environment in America? Home and school. And so by 1954, we have two very significant Supreme Court decisions which have ratified the social engineering that is now put in place by the elites in America. Berman versus Parker, which is the urban renewal Supreme Court decision, and of course Brown versus School Board, which is the more famous, and that is the desegregation decision that is going to change, end segregation in the South. Now, as I said, there is reason. Myrdal was contacted in the late 30s. He submitted a proposal in January 28th, 1939. The proposal was accepted, and then he came to America. And then in April of 1940, okay, so we're talking about a little over a year from the time he began the project till April of 1940, which is when the Nazis invaded Denmark and Norway. At that point, Myrdal left the country, and he never returned. Now, you know, that's 1 year to write a 1,400-page book. Not even I could do that. Okay? The clue to who did do it is in the preface of the book, where he says that he's going to leave this project. He's going home, but I am leaving this project in the capable hands of Samuel A. Stouffer, a man whom he identifies as a sociologist at the University of Chicago. He also mentions another University of Chicago sociologist by the name of Louis Wirth. What he doesn't tell us is that these two men were the head of the psychological warfare operation for the United States government. It was called a number of different names, but one was the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. The branch that these two guys worked for was called the OWI, or Office of War Information. The University of Chicago, as you probably know, was created by the Rockefellers. And you know, when they create something, they know what they're doing, and they want their monies, or a good return on their money. And so what they got as a return on their money came to be known as sociology, or social sciences, which included John B. Watson, behaviorism, and it also included Louis Wirth, who was one of the major American sociologists. Louis Wirth was a German Jew who had been given a scholarship brought over by his uncle, and eventually excelled as a student and caught the eye of the Rockefeller people, and was brought into the University of Chicago. And in the mid-30s, the University of Chicago, because of a conference held by the Rockefellers, decided to resurrect the psychological warfare operation under Frank Creel during World War I, the Committee for Public Information. And so sociology and psychological warfare, as of 1939, are one and the same thing. So if you put it in the hands of these people, you're putting it into the hands of the psychological warfare establishment. Okay, what else do we know about Louis Wirth? Well, you have to read between the lines here, because his daughter has come up with a severely censored version of this man, but basically he was a follower of Stalin. He was a communist, but not only communist, but many people, many Jews were communists at this point, but a great admirer of Stalin, but not just Stalin in general, but Stalin in particular, as Wirth would say, as the man who solved the nationalities problem in the Soviet Union. What is the nationalities problem in the Soviet Union? It is basically that the Soviet Union is an empire composed of various ethnic groups. How do you get unity out of a country that has all of these different ethnic groups to speak all of these different languages? The answer to that in the theoretical realm is to get them to identify with class rather than nation. And so basically what we do is say we're all really just workers and farmers, and so therefore that will override any national consideration that we might have. Now, if you're an astute person, you probably notice that there are similarities between the Soviet Union and the United States. The United States is in exactly the same situation. In other words, it's an artificial construct, an idea that has been imposed on an area of land which is inhabited by large numbers of different ethnic groups. And so what did Louis Wirth see himself here as? He saw himself as the successor of Joseph Stalin. First in the theoretical realm, but then it got much more specific than that, because at the beginning of World War II, Stalin was faced with Stalin and Louis Wirth, let's put it this way, felt that they were both faced with the same problem. Namely, how do you mobilize the entire population when some of the population come from people that we're now at war with? This, in particular, Wirth was mentioning Germans, and as a resident of Chicago, Chicago was one of the biggest German cities in America. Henry Regnery came from Chicago, a man of happy memory, a man who was very kind to me, the publisher of William Buckley and Russell Kirk. And Henry told me the story of the Chicago Symphony. Must have been around 1919, the first anti-German wave in America. The director of the symphony comes in and calls a big meeting, and he says, look, you know the situation now. America's at war with Germany. From now on, we are not going to be speaking any German. No German whatsoever. Not in rehearsals, not during concerts, never. Do you understand that? And the little voice from the back of the room said, was hat gesagt? That shows you the German influence. This was an issue here. It became an issue for Louis Wirth. What happened here, Louis Wirth gave a paper in 1941 in which he said basically, there's some people who are suspect because of their origin. Now, where does this fit into America's principles? This is what I'd like to know. How do you become suspect of your origin when basically everyone in this country is an ethnic group from someplace else? Well, it means that your group has power and the other group doesn't. For Louis Wirth and his supporters, the Rockefellers, the University of Chicago, the Psychological Warfare Establishment Society, Catholicism and fascism were politically indistinguishable. This was of special concern to the intelligence community because in Wirth's words, the totalitarian nations of Europe have substantial representations of their subjects or former subjects in the United States. He goes on to say, of our total foreign white stock of 38,727,593 people, more than 1/6 is German and nearly 1/8 is Italian. If we note further that Italians have the highest percentage of any major immigrant groups unable to speak English, we have further reason to fear their exclusive susceptibility to news and propaganda purveyed by their foreign language press, which in part has been subsidized by agencies of the mother country's government. The change in ethnic makeup in the country that began in 1880 brought with it, according to Wirth, a corresponding, this is a direct quote, a corresponding shift in religious affiliation of the American population, making the nation now a little over 1/3 Roman Catholic. Direct quote. And as if that weren't bad enough, that's me now. Many of these people dominate, quote, certain highly skilled occupations in essential defense industries. In fact, and this is a quote again, some of the key skilled jobs are virtually monopolized by certain groups whose national origin makes them suspect. Now, wait a minute. Where is this in the Constitution of the United States that certain groups coming from certain places are less than adequate as American citizens? It's not in any of our official documents. This is part of the hypocrisy of the United States that goes on and on and on and on. Basically, you have the government declaring war against certain groups because a certain group of the elite has decided they can't trust them. This has nothing to do with democracy. It gets even more complicated. Wirth never gets around to explaining the criteria whereby establish which nations are ipso facto suspect, but he includes Poland and Ireland in the list. In fact, the only thing which the Irish and Polish, who viewed each other as generally members of mutually alien races at the time, the only thing they had in common other than American citizenship was the fact that they were Catholic. In other words, this was a communality which existed only in the eyes of the people who considered them a threat, certainly not in the minds of the Polish and the Irish themselves. Now, this is a man, as I said, who believes there's no such thing as human nature. He believes that everything a man does is what he's been trained to do by his environment, because he learned that from John B. Watson, who was also at the University of Chicago. So given that, it seems pretty clear what's going to happen, and he draws these conclusions very clearly. In 1943, there was the biggest race riot in America took place in Detroit, and Louis Wirth was sent there to investigate it, and in there he said, basically wrote back a report in which he said, look, this is not the time for theoretical discussions. This is the time for sensible adjustments in housing. That's what he said, sensible adjustments in housing. What did he mean by that? Well, in order to explain that, I have to take one step back. America is now in the war. We have a huge problem in terms of labor shortage because there's no foreign workers coming in anymore. There's only let's put it this way, two untapped sources of labor, the black folk down south and women. And of the people who are more easily mobilized, it's the black folk down south. The government needs to get them from cotton fields, where they're really not necessary anymore, up to factories in the north. And that's not really difficult because all the wage differential will do it, and the trains will take them up. And if you go to Chicago now, there's a statue of this Negro from Mississippi with a cardboard suitcase and a rope wrapped around it, a memorial of the greatest internal migration in United States history, namely the black migration up from places like Mississippi to Chicago. That's what they wanted to do. That was in their interest. And the only problem they had was, where are these people going to live? The Depression had preceded this era. Nobody built anything during the Depression. Every neighborhood in Chicago was pretty much settled, and it was all settled according to the principle I've already told you about. It was ethnic groups from various European countries who were allowed to take hegemony over these particular neighborhoods. So it was the Germans, the Poles, the Irish, and that's what the American system was. Now, you combine all of these things that I'm talking about with this labor shortage. We need real short-term effects here. So what did they decide to do? They decided to kill two birds with one stone by bringing the Negroes into Polish neighborhoods, which is exactly what happened in Detroit. The first project. Detroit is nothing but open land. You could build it any place you want, but they built it in St. Louis the King parish, which was right in the middle of a Polish parish, and it caused enormous amounts of social disruption right at the time in the middle of the war. And if you remember the Culture Wars issue I did on this, great dramatic pictures of Detroit cops on horseback, clubbing the Poles with their nightsticks, or the Poles standing there with their clubs with razor blades in the end of them, ready to attack the police. And in the middle of all this, these petrified black families who were scared to death in the middle of being dragged into or escorted into these high-rise apartment buildings. That was the solution. That was the killing two birds with one stone. Give the blacks a place to live, and you disrupt at the same time the social cohesion of all of these ethnic neighborhoods, these groups of people who are suspect because of their origin. That's what you do. What's the big word for that? If you want the big word for that, the big picture word for that, go back to Stalin again. Because this is exactly what Stalin was involved in the Soviet Union at exactly the same time as Wirth was involved in Detroit. And I'm saying, look, Wirth could not have not known what Stalin was doing. He was in military intelligence. He was a devotee of Stalin. And at a certain point, everything that Stalin did was made public. at the time it was made public. What was the word that I'm trying to come up with here? The word is ethnic cleansing. 1937, Stalin deported Soviet Koreans to Central Asia. In 1941, he deported the Volga Germans to Siberia. And my daughter-in-law's grandmother was one of those Volga Deutsch that got an all-expenses-paid trip to Siberia because of Stalin, because she could not be trusted there. In 1943, he deported the Kalmyks from their homes just west of Astrakhan to Kazakhstan. The 1937 deportation of the Koreans had been kept secret, but the deportation of the Volga Deutsch and the Kalmyks were announced in the official Soviet ukases when their ethnic Soviet republics were abolished by Stalin. Since Wirth was working as one of the leading theoreticians of our military intelligence establishment at this time, it is impossible that he was unaware of what was going on. So ethnic cleansing became the official policy of the government of the United States during World War II. There's no question in my mind. If you want the proof, the books, I went through all these archives, University of Chicago archive, it's all in the Slaughter of Cities. This did not stop after the war was over. You would think that, well, we defeated fascism, so therefore, what's the threat, guys? The Italians and the Germans, what's the threat? You know, we defeated their home countries. Well, that was never the issue to begin with, because we were never at war with Ireland and Poland, were we? At least I didn't hear about this. No, it continued because the new threat was the Catholic Church. And if you want some type of historical reference on that, the mind of the people then, I recommend the Paul Blanchard and his book, American Freedom and Catholic Power. 1947, Paul Blanchard starts writing articles in The Nation, which is a socialist magazine, talking about the threat that the Catholic Church posed to American ideals, as, of course, defined by Paul Blanchard. In his book, he said that Bertrand Russell, who was a big star at the time, especially among the ADA crowd, the WASP and Jews in Philadelphia, Bertrand Russell said that his greatest fear was that America was going to become a Catholic country and that they were going to do it by the numbers, which is to say by demographic increase, which leads us to the big sin that Catholics were committing at this time, was that they were having sexual intercourse without birth control. And as a result, they were having children. And I am the product of this. We were known as the baby boom, which was largely a Catholic phenomenon. Lots and lots of Catholic offspring. And as the population control people know very well, population and political power are very related. As a matter of fact, you can't really have one political power without the other, population. And now people all across the world are waking up to this thing. And this was the basis behind, the reason behind all of this push for population control that took place at this time. So what happened is that basically Louis Wirth, who was still around, got to inflict this on the citizens of Chicago, but the government inflicted it on every big city in the northern states of the United States. So across the board, you had, it was especially dramatic in Chicago, what you had was civil war. Civil war. And it all came down to some black family being moved surreptitiously into the neighborhood. Suddenly, the largely Catholic population erupts in outrage, and there are people... America and Commonweal were appalled at this, but there were people, kids with their Catholic high school letter sweaters on, throwing rocks and fire bombs at the new apartment buildings, trying to drive the intruders out. This is crucial to understand what's going on. The Catholic intelligentsia at this point were horrified and scandalized by what was going on. And this was one great manifestation of what we have come to know as the Catholic inferiority complex, which continues to rage in America and is now manifested largely in the realm of economics by people like Michael Novak and Tom Woods, but we'll get into that later. But this was an early manifestation of this Catholic, because what happened here is that we simply couldn't frame the issue. We as Catholics could not frame the issue. We simply could not speak of it in any other terms than, let's say, the Quakers were using, and the Quakers were involved up to their eyeballs in conspiracies to destroy Catholic neighborhoods. One of them was known as the Cicero Project, named after that suburb of Chicago. 1951, a black family moves into Cicero, and the entire Catholic population erupts, and all those Catholic high school students are throwing rocks, and everyone is appalled, and everyone blames the Catholics. Well, the real story came out later. It's in the book. It was a conspiracy. The Cicero Project was funded by Marshall Field, the Marshall Field Foundation. It was a group of Quakers were heavily involved. Louis Wirth and his crowd were involved, and Catholics were involved. There was a Catholic fifth column that had been created, and it was called the Catholic Interracial Council, founded by a man of goodwill by the name of John Lafarge, and then taken over by people whom I would not characterize as men of goodwill, namely Sergeant Shriver, who is the father of the wife of the governor of California now, and the brother-in-law of John F. Kennedy. Sergeant Shriver was the head of the Catholic the Catholic Interracial Council when they were involved in the Cicero Project, which means when they were involved in the conspiracy to break up Catholic neighborhoods, being paid for by the Marshall Fields Foundation. The net result of this, as I said, was civil war, and in a sense, by 1954, democracy did triumph over these people. The head of the Chicago Housing Authority was run out of town. The head of the Philadelphia Housing Authority was run out of town. And there was what you would call the last gasp, the last hurrah of the Catholic politician. In Philadelphia, it was Jim Tate. Later than any place else. In Chicago, it was Mayor Daley, Elder Mayor Daley. And they, in effect, reasserted their control, democratic control over these cities. And the revenge came later. The revenge is always, when you're dealing with powerful forces like this, they're not going to take no for an answer. But it did succeed for a little bit, and there was a little element of stability injected. But then it came back, and it came back. But before it came back, the bishops had to issue a statement. And the bishops issued their statement on race in 1958. And it was a classic instance of internalizing the commands of your oppressors, because all the bishops were totally under the influence of the Catholic Interracial Council, who was then under the influence of people like Sergeant Shriver and Dennis Clark of Philadelphia. And they were reacting to something that was basically not our problem. The problem was the South's problem. They had the problem of segregation. There was no segregation in Chicago. This is something that when Martin Luther King brought his crowd to Chicago, one of these ladies was down, Dorothy Tillman. She says, down south, you was either black or white. Up here, you were Polish and Irish and all of that stuff. It was clear that there were two different systems in place, and the bishops were reacting to the wrong system. They're writing an encyclical about what happened in Little Rock, Arkansas. That's not what is happening in Chicago. What's happening in Little Rock, Arkansas is a long, complicated issue that has to do with the loss of the Civil War, the redemption of the South, all that type of stuff. It's a different part of the country. I'm tempted to say a different country as well. I tried to bring this out in the Sam Francis talk. You know, Sam and I are not white. You know, we're not white. You're a Southern Protestant. I'm a Northern Catholic. We come from two different ethnic groups. That's the situation. This is something the bishops were incapable of understanding. So what they said was that the Negro is a child of God. Well, okay, what Catholic ever denied that? This what the bishops should have done, if they'd been permitted by the government, is to say, the blacks from Mississippi are an ethnic group just like the Poles. And just as the Poles had their ethnic parish, the blacks from Mississippi are going to have their ethnic parish. And they will have an ethnic community, and they can work things out there, and it will all be integrated into a great framework known as the Catholic Church, where all nations are going to be baptized and follow Jesus Christ. They could have done that in Chicago, and they could have done it in Philadelphia, and the trouble is the Cardinal Doherty opted not to do that. In other words, what happened here is that race supplanted ethnicity. Race is not a Catholic concept. Race is a meaningless concept. What's the Greek word for race? If it doesn't have a Greek word, it doesn't exist, right? I mean, what's the Greek word for hard drive? So hard drives don't exist, right? It's something, I can work that details out. I'll do that later. But anyway, the word is nation or ethnos, and that means ethnic group. It means a group with this particular language, and nobody really particularly cared what the color of your skin was, because you had an ethnic group that had a particular... When I went to Kenya, I was confronted by the fact that there are 76 ethnic groups in Kenya, and they're all black, and they all get involved in fighting each other at various points, okay? They all have different languages. This is a fundamental fact of human existence. Ethnos is like the family. It's part of nature. You can't get rid of it. Even though this is exactly what the government had embarked upon, the abolition of ethnos in America. So what did the bishops do? They said the Negro is a child of God, and they said, according to the principles of equality, you can't discriminate against them. First of all, the principle of equality is not a Catholic principle. As I remember, it came from the French Revolution. Liberty, fraternity, equality. That's not a Catholic principle. Not even in America is it a Catholic principle. Even they can't change it. So here we're importing foreign principles because basically they wanted to come up with a justification for Catholic support of social engineering. What a stupid idea that was. The very institution that is destroying Catholic neighborhoods with far-reaching effects, I would say, for the transmission of the faith, the very instrument, they have come out and supported it in their statement on race. A colossally stupid move. And so what happened? Well, what happened is destruction. There's no other word for it. The first was the destruction of the Catholic neighborhood. Catholics were now, you were no longer, if you lived in Chicago, you were Polish or you were Italian or Irish, and you belonged to a certain parish, and you identified yourself by the parish you belonged to. But once, after years and years and years of this ongoing civil war and subjected to this brutal form of social engineering, they started to migrate away. And this had been planned for them as well, because we're talking about a government that wants to manipulate the entire spectrum of the environment. And to do that, they came up with a carrot and they came up with a stick. We've already talked about the stick. It's these hordes of Mississippians marching into your neighborhood. And the crime that all of these immigrants brought, every immigrant group brings crime with it because they're all uprooted. That's the stick. What's the carrot? The carrot is Lake Forest or Levittown or all of these new automobile suburbs that are growing up outside of the city, where you can get a cheap mortgage, an FHA guaranteed mortgage. It's real cheap. The house is real cheap. And you can move out. And you know what? You're not Polish anymore. You're middle class, which is exactly, if you remember the Soviet Union, remember what the goal here is? Replace class with ethnicity. I'm sorry, no more ethnicity, now it's class. You're not Polish, you're middle class now. You're working for a corporation. You have been assimilated, you've made it, and so on and so forth. That's the carrot. And you combine that with the stick, and you got a hugely powerful force that basically emptied out the entire south side of Chicago over a period of 20 years. A hugely effective form of ethnic cleansing. I'd say the most effective form ever in the history of the earth. Much more effective than the Soviet Union's version. Certainly more effective than the crude form that got practiced in places like Bosnia in the 90s. This is much more effective because it's based, as all of this psychological warfare is, it's based on the engineering of consent. And believe me, consent is something that you can engineer. Believe me. America has proven that. So what happened? We're beleaguered, we're staggering. I'm saying that what happened is that maybe the Latin Mass did have a big effect. But I'm saying, before you factor that into the equation, look into the destruction of the actual social order as Catholics knew it in this country, because that was the parish. That was a community. That was a community where you could talk. You could talk about Quadragesimo Anno, because I was there when people did talk about Quadragesimo Anno. I was there in Philadelphia when the Jesuits like Father Comey would have their labor relations council, and my friend's father would go down there to these meetings with Father Comey on a regular basis, and he was a union guy. And it was, how are the union guys going to work together with the management guys? Well, that's a good thing, isn't it? Isn't that a good thing? And this is because they were Catholic and because they took their Catholic social teaching seriously, but also because they occupied the territory. Let's face it, that's important. If you want to have a society, it's got to exist somewhere, and it's got to exist in a concrete fashion. And if you destroy that society, you actually drive the people out of that area, and you disperse them all over these godforsaken suburbs out there, where the only thing you have in common is what you saw on TV last night. There's going to be serious social consequences, and there's going to be serious religious and theological consequences. I'm saying we should think about that when we think about what happened to the Catholic faith during this period of time. So the final blow comes in 1966 when Martin Luther King arrives in Chicago. Now, why is Martin Luther King in Chicago? Well, no one knew. And most of all, the black ministers in Chicago, they didn't know either, and they all wrote a joint letter, which they published publicly in one of the newspapers, urging him to go back home, because he didn't understand Chicago, and that's exactly what Myrdal said. Martin Luther King is from another city, and he doesn't understand the situation there. Well, he didn't, and he paid the price because it was the biggest debacle of his entire career. Nobody seems to understand this, but the civil rights movement collapsed in 1966 when Martin Luther King went to Chicago. Basically, he showed up in places like Marquette Park. Marquette Park were Lithuanians. And the Lithuanians didn't even know they were white until they got here. And suddenly they're being accused of having slaves, or somebody had slaves, because you white guys all have slaves, right? So therefore you Lithuanians must have had slaves at some point or other. And so therefore you're responsible. My favorite incident here was a shakedown artist by the name of Muhammad Kenyatta in Philadelphia, who would show up at Presbyterian churches and say, "You folks own slaves, I'm black, make the check out to me." $250,000. And of course the Quakers did make a check out to Muhammad Kenyatta for $250,000, gave him a building, and so the revolution was starting in Philadelphia, because they were the vehicle of the revolution there. I got an email from Muhammad Kenyatta's son who wrote to me and says, "I don't think my dad was a shakedown artist." Well, I'm happy you felt that way, it's filial piety, but your father was a shakedown artist. But anyway, my favorite incident is Muhammad Kenyatta shows up at, I don't know, Our Lady of Pompeii Church in Chester. Well, where do you think Our Lady of Pompeii, where do you think they came from? They're all Italians, and Muhammad Kenyatta shows up and he tries to extort money from the Italians because of slavery. Well, it didn't work. This was something he eventually said about Cardinal Cole, "Man, that guy is tough. He didn't budge an inch." So he wasn't like the Quakers, and there was something these are people, I remember when nobody's grandparents spoke English. It was sort of like a rule in Philadelphia. Nobody's grandparents spoke English. And this was part of that era. So what are they supposed to think, about this black guy coming in and trying to get money out of us? Anyway, this was sort of Martin Luther King rolled up in a nutshell. He showed up in Marquette Park. The Lithuanians started throwing rocks at him. He got hit in the head with a rock. He falls down. And so the call for help goes out. And guess who answers the call? Father Hesburgh of Notre Dame. And the most famous icon now at Notre Dame University is the picture of Father Hesburgh with his arms like this, singing "We Shall Overcome" with Martin Luther King. In Chicago, as Martin Luther King was destroying Catholic neighborhoods. This was the tragedy of basically a Catholic church that had been decapitated, had no intellectual ability whatsoever, a Catholic Church incapable of thinking for itself, a Catholic Church which had totally internalized the commands of its oppressors. Cheering on Martin Luther King and Father Hesburgh, cheering on the destruction, the ethnic cleansing of the South Side of Chicago. That's the tragedy. Notre Dame story is another story. I got lots of stories, but I'm just going to focus on this point at this point. What is the common denominator here? Common denominator is lack of unity. Why are we here? Why are we here? Because our world was destroyed. That's why we're here. That's why we're not at Visitation anymore. That's why we're in Winfield, godforsaken suburbs like Winfield. I don't even know where Winfield is. No one knows where it is. We're hiding out in chapels in Winfield when we should be in these great basilicas that dot places like Detroit, some of which have been destroyed, some of which have been restored. I'm saying we're not going to get anywhere until we restore this type of unity. And I think that there are hopeful signs that unity is coming back. It's a topic we'd like to talk about later this year or next year in South Bend about the end of dialogue, the beginning of unity. I think that we're beginning to see this. We're starting to see it happen, almost in spite of the what should I say? The commands that these people feel that they have to explain. The Pope does the Good Friday prayer for the Jews. The Jews are furious. The Williamson affair is their counterattack to prevent the Society of Pius X from being integrated back into the church. They've dug in their heels. They're not going to let it happen. This is a struggle that's before us. The Anglicans, after 500 years of negative consequences for the entire world that resulted from the looting of Catholic property in England and the ideology that came from that looting, namely capitalism. After 500 years of that vicious ideology, the Pope just allowed a number of Anglicans back without any discussion. They called up the Archbishop of Canterbury. What do you think? I don't know. I just heard about it myself. Well, that means that dialogue, in some sense, has been superseded. And I'm saying this is what we have to work for. We have to work for this type of unity. There's never been a time when unity wasn't flawed, but there's never been a time when we have had less unity now than we had, even in this hostile country of ours. That's the goal. I'll talk more about the real, what I see as the real source of disunity that has created the modern world, which all happened in the middle of the 15th century. I'll talk about that this afternoon, but thank you very much.